So, were you successful? Here's my solution. I would create this users service as we are asked to. And in there, we of course export a class, the users service. We don't need to add injectable right now because right now we're not injecting a service in there. And here I now want to manage my users. Now you could create one array of users and there store objects, which for each object also tracks the state of that user. I will go with two arrays, so I will have my active and my inactive users, the two arrays from the app component. So I'll copy it from there and paste it into my user service. But again, as an improvement, you could store objects in one single array there, which then allows you to switch the status for each object, for each user. So this is this. And then I want to add a set to active method. Here I expect to get the ID of the element as should switch. And a set to inactive method. And here, of course, also you could optimize this by having one method which does both and which receives an additional argument which determines whether you want to switch active to inactive or the other way around. Well, in set to active, I want to reach out to my active users and push a new element to them. That new element is in my inactive users, the user with the ID I'm receiving there. And thereafter, I can simply splice that user. Splice will simply remove this one element in this case here. Well, now I can copy that code, paste it in here, and reverse it. Push it to the inactive users, from the active users, and splice it from the active users. Now this service is prepared. And now in my app component, I can get rid of these two methods. I also can delete my users here. So we can completely clean this component and we can clean everything in the template of the app component. We don't need to pass the properties to our components there because these components can reach out to the service on their own. Now, it is important to make sure that we provide the service on the right level. If we would provide it in the inactive user component and the active user component, we would have two different instances of that service. And therefore, it would not work. We could not switch because we would work with two different arrays. So, with four different arrays actually. So therefore, this is not the right place to provide it. We could provide it here in the app component or in the app module. Now, since we don't plan on injecting this service in another service or something like this, there is no reason to provide it application-wide, though you could do that. That's not wrong, not bad. But I will simply provide it here in the app component. But again, just to highlight this, it's not bad or wrong to provide it in the app module. So here I will provide my users service. Make sure to also add the import. With that provided on this level, active users and inactive users will actually share the same service, the same instance of that service. So now I can go to inactive users, add a constructor here, and get my users service here. So of type users service, of course, user service is the name actually. Make sure to add the import here too. You always need to add this. That's a TypeScript feature, not related to Angular. And then I can remove the input here. We're not receiving it from outside anymore. I can remove my whole output, my whole event here, and also remove this where I emit it. Remove all these imports therefore. And now I want to initialize my users array. I will do it in onInit as again, it is a good practice to do initialization work in there. So let's implement onInit, make sure to import it. And then we need to add the ng onInit method. And in there I can set my users equal to the users I fetch from my users service. And we're in the inactive component here, so I should get my inactive users. Now with that, I can simply copy that code over to the active users, replace my input and my output here too, and remove the input string, remove all these imports, but on the other hand, make sure to import user service and implement onInit. So just like in the other component, make sure to import onInit too and import this service. And here, we don't have to emit this event anymore. Instead, make sure that now users is not the inactive users, but the active users, since we're in the active users component. And if we click on set to inactive, I want to reach out to the user service and call set to inactive and pass on this ID. And on the other hand, in the inactive service, I want to do the same, reach out to the user service, and here call set to active and pass the ID. That should be all. Let's see if this works. If our app here is reloaded, I can still switch my users around. So this first part does work, but boy is it leaner, much less passing around, instead having a clean central service. Now the other part of the task was to add this counter service. So let's add this to the counter service.ts file. Let's export a class here, the counter service, like this. And here I simply want to manage my active to inactive counter, which starts at 0, and, well, you guessed it, inactive to active counter, which also starts at 0. And now I simply want to add two methods where I say increment active to inactive. Of course, you can choose another name. And here I will simply say active to inactive counter plus plus and log the new counter, so the active to inactive counter. And then I will just duplicate this to also have my inactive to active counter, where I increase the inactive to active counter property and log the inactive to active counter property. You probably dream about inactive to active this night. But this is our counter service. Now here, you could add it in multiple places. You could add it here in the onSet to active or the onSet to inactive methods. That would be all right. But I want to add it here in my user service. So I want to inject it into a service. And for this, we have to take two things into account. First of all, we have to make sure that we provide the counter service here in the app module. So counter service. Make sure to add the import here too. Now it's available application-wide and therefore can also be injected into other services. Second, to inject a service into a service, what would you need to do? You need to add injectable to the service where you want to inject it in, right? So to the users service here, not to counter service, to user service, to the receiving service. So here I will add injectable. Don't forget the parentheses, that's a common mistake. Add the import. And with that, I can now inject the counter service in the user service. So here, counter service of type counter service. Make sure to import this type here at the top too. And with that injected, here in set to active, I can call this counter service. And since we set something to active, I want to call the increment inactive to active because we set something from inactive to active. And on the other hand, in the set to inactive, I want to increment the, well, active to inactive. So this one here. With that, if we now save this and let our app reload, and I click to set to inactive, we see that is 1. Maybe improve the output here that we say active to inactive, and then we output the number. And on the other hand, down here, we have inactive to active. So now let's just reload. Active to inactive 1, 2, and now we should add 4 to the inactive to active side and some to the active to inactive. So this is working. Everything seems to work as intended. This is my solution. Of course, you might have a different solution. There are different ways of achieving the same. Overall, you should feel confident using services now. You should see their benefits and how you might use them in your next project. Let's move on.